There are moments in life that don't announce themselves with fanfare or flashing lights. They arrive quietly, in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday, in the middle of a crowd, in the middle of grief so heavy it has no name. And yet, somehow, everyone feels it at once. Like a single drop of water touching still surface, the ripple moves outward and reaches every shore. That is what happened on one particular day in Britain, when two people, a prince and a princess, a husband and a wife, simply walked. Just walked. And in doing so, they said everything that words had failed to say for months. The morning started like most mornings do in the English countryside. Gray skies pressing low over the hills, a cold wind carrying the smell of wet earth, and something older, something ancestral. The kind of morning that makes people pull their coats tighter and think about those they've lost. Inside the walls of the royal estate, Catherine, Princess of Wales, was awake before the sun had properly risen. She had been awake for hours, actually. Sleep had not come easily in recent months. That was no secret. Not to her husband, not to the small circle of people who truly knew her, and certainly not to the millions of people who had watched her disappear from public life and then slowly, carefully begin to reappear. She had faced something that no title, no palace, no amount of privilege could shield a person from. She had faced cancer, a quiet, terrifying, deeply personal battle fought mostly in private, mostly in whispers, and mostly in the long, dark hours when everyone else was asleep. But on this morning, something was different. She had made a decision, not suddenly, but through weeks of conversations, careful thought, medical guidance, and something deeper than all of that. Something in her chest that said, it is time. Not time to pretend that everything was fine. Not time to perform strength she didn't fully feel yet. But time to step forward. Honestly, genuinely, as herself. William knew before she said a word. After more than 2 decades together, through university romance, long-distance heartache, a royal wedding watched by billions, the raising of 3 children, the loss of his mother's memory rebuilt through his own fatherhood, he had learned to read her in the way that only people who have truly lived together can. He saw it in the set of her shoulders that morning. He saw it in the way she stood at the window a little longer than usual, looking out at the grounds with something that was not sadness and not quite peace, but something honest and in between. He came to stand beside her. He didn't ask questions. He just stood there, close enough that their arms touched, and they looked out at the same gray morning together. That image, though no camera captured it, would become the quiet foundation of everything that followed that day. The decision to step out had not been made lightly. Catherine's cancer diagnosis, revealed to the public in March 2024 in a video message that stopped the world in its tracks, had sent a shockwave through Britain and through every corner of the globe where people had grown up watching her. She had been the steady presence, the warm smile, the woman who knelt down to speak to children at eye level, who remembered names, who sent handwritten notes. She was not just a princess in a fairy tale. She had become something more complicated and more real than that. A human being doing an enormously difficult job with visible grace, and now doing the hardest job of all, which was simply surviving. The months that followed her announcement were strange and sacred. The public held its breath. Newspapers printed updates in cautious language. Well-wishers left flowers outside palace gates. Children drew cards. Strangers prayed in languages Catherine would never hear, in countries she would never visit, because grief and care do not require geography. William, in that time, had become something that no royal protocol manual had ever quite prepared him for. He was a husband watching his wife fight for her life. He was a father explaining the unexplainable to 3 young children. He was a future king trying to hold his family together while also holding himself together, which is perhaps the lonelier of the 2 tasks. There were days, people close to him would later say, when he simply sat in silence, not out of coldness or distance, but because there are no right words for what he was carrying. And yet, and this is where the story turns, he showed up. Every single day, he showed up, to the school runs, to the medical appointments, to the quiet evenings at home when the children needed normalcy, and Routine, even as nothing felt normal or routine. He showed up not as a prince performing duty, but as a man who loved his family and refused to let fear make him absent. Britain noticed. The world noticed. And in noticing, something shifted in the way people saw him. Not the heir, not the future king, not the son of Charles or the son of Diana, but William. Just William. A man doing his best in impossible circumstances. By the time autumn arrived, Catherine had completed her course of preventive chemotherapy. The announcement came in September 2024, delivered in another video message, this one filmed outdoors in golden light, with the warmth of recovery beginning to show in her face. She spoke clearly. She spoke gratefully. She said she was not yet fully healed, that healing would take time, and that she intended to return to her public duties, carefully, gradually, honestly. The public response was enormous. Relief flooded social media. News anchors visibly emotional on live television. Strangers on buses in London telling each other it was good news. Because when something touches the collective heart deeply enough, we become temporarily less like strangers. But there was something underneath the relief, something more complex. People had watched Catherine go through something real. Not a staged struggle, not a curated vulnerability, but actual illness, actual fear, actual uncertainty. And they had watched William stand beside her through it. Not perfectly, not without his own visible strain, but steadily. And now, as she began to return, the question that hung unspoken in the air was, what does this do to them? What does going through something that enormous do to two people? Does it crack what was already cracking? Does it bind what was already bound? The answer, it turned out, would begin to become visible on a particular day when the two of them stepped out together. Not for a state event, not for a diplomatic function, not for anything that required them to wear their public faces in the way that public faces are worn. They stepped out simply to be present, to stand in a place that mattered, surrounded by people who had never stopped caring, and to say, without a press release, without a prepared speech, without anything rehearsed, that they were still here, still together, still moving forward. The location chosen was not accidental. It carried weight, the quiet kind of weight that comes not from grandeur but from meaning. It was a place connected to community, to service, to the kind of ordinary human life that both William and Catherine had, in their own ways, always reached toward even from within the extraordinary constraints of royal existence. When they arrived, something happened that no one had quite anticipated. The crowd, ordinary people, families, older couples, young parents with children on their shoulders, went quiet for just a moment. Not the hushed silence of formality, but the instinctive silence of recognition. The kind that happens when something you have been hoping for arrives, and you need a second to absorb it. And then the sound came. Not the thunderous roar of a stadium or the polished applause of a state occasion. Something warmer, more uneven, more human. People calling out her name. People simply saying, "Welcome back." A woman near the front who had clearly been crying and was not embarrassed about it. A child who had no idea of the weight of the moment, but felt the energy of the adults around her and clapped with enormous enthusiasm anyway. Catherine smiled. A real smile, the kind that reaches the eyes, the kind that cannot be manufactured. And beside her, William smiled too, and for just a moment, they looked at each other with the look of two people who have been through something together and are still standing on the same side of it. That look, brief, unguarded, real, was photographed. It traveled across the world within hours. People who had never met either of them, who lived in cities and towns and villages where royal families were distant mythology, stopped scrolling and felt something. Because love that has been tested and has held as one of the oldest and most recognizable things a human face can show. And it does not require translation. But the day was not only about the warmth of reunion. It was also, quietly, about something heavier. Britain itself was in a complicated place. The country had been through its own long season of difficulty. Economic strain pressing on ordinary families, political uncertainty that had become almost a permanent condition, a collective exhaustion that showed up in small ways everywhere, in shorter tempers, and longer silences. People were tired. Not dramatically, not in ways that made headlines, but in the deeper, slower way that comes from too much uncertainty for too long. Into that landscape, the image of William and Catherine walking forward together landed differently than it might have in easier times. It became, for many people, something they hadn't known they needed, evidence that things could hold, that people could go through the worst and come out the other side still choosing each other, still choosing to show up, still choosing forward. It was, in the most literal sense, just a step, one foot in front of the other, two people walking. But a nation felt it in a way that went far beyond the physical act. Because sometimes the most powerful things are also the simplest. And sometimes the step that speaks the loudest is the one taken quietly on an ordinary gray morning by two people who have decided, together, to keep going. The day was only beginning, but something had already shifted in the crowd, in the country, and in the private, unspoken space between a husband and wife who had walked through fire and were walking still side by side. There's a particular kind of courage that has no audience. It happens behind closed doors in the middle of the night, in conversations no journalist will ever transcribe and no camera will ever capture. It is the courage of choosing to stay, not because it is easy and not because there is no pain, but because something in you recognizes that this person, this life, this family is worth the difficulty of remaining present. William had been living inside that kind of courage for months. And on the day he and Catherine stepped out together, the world caught its first real glimpse of what quiet, private strength looks like when it finally becomes visible. The afternoon stretched out slowly, the way afternoons do when something important is happening, and time seems to understand that it should give the moment room. The program for the day included several stops, a community center, a brief walk through a small garden area that had been dedicated to something meaningful, a conversation with local volunteers who have been doing the kind of quiet, unglamorous good that never makes the front page, but keeps communities alive. These were the kinds of engagements Catherine had always been drawn to. Not the grand gestures, but the specific ones. The individual faces. The real stories. She moved through the afternoon with a deliberateness that people who knew her well immediately recognized. She was not rushing. She was not performing energy she didn't have. She was simply present, fully, carefully, intentionally present. There's a difference between someone going through motions and someone actually inhabiting a moment, and the people she spoke to that afternoon felt the difference immediately. One volunteer, a woman in her 60s who had been running a local food program for years, would later say that when the princess looked at her and asked about the work, she felt genuinely seen. Not processed, not managed. Seen. That quality, the ability to make a person feel as though they're the only person in the room, even when a room is full of people, had always been Catherine's gift. What was remarkable on this day was that she carried it through what was clearly personal effort. She was not at full strength. Anyone looking honestly could see that. There was a careful quality to her movements, a thoughtful economy of energy that spoke to someone still in the process of recovery rather than someone fully recovered. And yet she chose to be there. She chose to give what she had to give. And the people she met, sensing both the effort and the genuine warmth behind it, were moved in a way that went beyond ordinary celebrity encounter. William, for his part, moved through the day in a way that told its own story. He had always been, by nature, more guarded than his wife in public settings, less immediately warm in the wide-open way that Catherine was, more contained, more watchful. These were qualities often misread as coldness or arrogance by people who did not look closely. Those who did look closely saw something different. A man who felt things deeply and protected that depth carefully because he had learned early and painfully what happened when deep feeling was left unprotected in public life. But on this day, something in him was more open than usual. Not recklessly so. William was never reckless. But perceptibly, the way he stood close to Catherine, the way his hand found the small of her back at certain moments, not possessively, but supportively, The gesture of someone who has learned through months of difficulty exactly where the other person needs steadiness. The way he laughed, genuinely, without the measured quality that usually filtered his public laughter, at something she said during one of the conversations. These are small things, but small things, observed carefully, tell enormous truths. A photographer who had covered dozens of royal engagements over many years said afterward that the day felt different in a way that was difficult to articulate technically. The body language between them had a quality he described simply as real. They were not performing togetherness. They were together. And there is, he noted, a very large difference. The children were not present, which was both understandable and quietly significant. George, Charlotte, and Louis had been the anchor of the family's private life throughout the hardest months. The reason William had kept structure and routine even on the days when structure felt like an enormous effort, the reason Catherine had fought with the particular ferocity that parents fight with, the reason there was always a morning to get to, a school to reach, a normal Tuesday to preserve inside the abnormal reality. They had been protected from public view throughout Catherine's illness, and that protection was continuing. But their presence was felt in the way that children are always felt even in their absence. It was there in the specific way Catherine spoke about family during one conversation. Not abstractly, but with the grounded warmth of someone for whom family is not a concept, but a collection of specific beloved faces. It was there in the way William occasionally glanced at his watch, not impatiently, but with the awareness of a parent calculating school pickup, even while standing in the middle of an official engagement. The children were home. They were safe. And both their parents were thinking about them, even while being fully present somewhere else, because that is the permanent, beautiful, exhausting reality of loving children. Several of the community members the couple met that day had brought their own children. There is an instinct when people who are parents meet other people who are parents toward a particular kind of recognition, a shared knowledge of sleepless nights and impossible love and the terror of vulnerability that comes with bringing small people into the world and being responsible for their safety. It crossed whatever social distance protocol requires that recognition. It moved between Catherine and the parent she spoke to in a current that was entirely human and entirely real. Across Britain, the day was being watched, not in the breathless, compulsive way of major breaking news, but in the quiet and attentive way of something that matters to people on a personal level. Pubs where screens were usually tuned to sport had the news on. Hospital wards where patients had been following Catherine's illness with particular identification. People going through their own treatments, their own fears, their own long, difficult months. Watch was something that looked like recognition and hope mixed together. A woman in a cancer treatment center in Manchester, receiving chemotherapy for the second time, watched the footage on a tablet and told the nurse beside her that it helped. She couldn't explain exactly how or why. It just did. That is the strange and complicated truth of public figures who go through something real in partial view of the world. Their experience, however, different from ordinary life in its context and resources, touches something universal. Cancer does not care about palaces. Fear does not discriminate by postcode. And the particular alchemy of a long-married couple choosing each other again on the other side of something terrible. That is a story recognizable to anyone who has ever loved someone through something hard. Britain had watched Catherine go in. Britain was now watching her come back out. And the emotional weight of that arc, the descent into illness, the long silence, the careful reemergence, had accumulated over months into something that now, on this particular afternoon, was releasing. There was a moment, mid-afternoon, that was not captured cleanly by any camera, but was reported by several people who were present. Catherine had been speaking with a group of young women involved in a mental health initiative. One of the causes she had been committed to for years, long before her illness, rooted in her genuine belief that early conversation about mental well-being could change the trajectory of young lives. The conversation had gone long, longer than the schedule strictly allowed, because one of the young women had said something that clearly moved her, and she had not been willing to cut it short for the sake of timing. When the conversation finally ended, As the group moved on to the next stop, Catherine paused for just a moment. William was a few steps ahead, already in conversation with someone else. She stood still for perhaps 3 or 4 seconds, eyes lowered, a stillness about her that was not sadness exactly, but something reflective and deep. Then she looked up. She looked at her husband's back, the familiar shape of him, the particular way he stands when he's engaged in conversation. And something moved across her face, a feeling too complex for a single word, visible only for that brief window before she stepped forward and rejoined the flow of the day. Those few seconds, noticed only by a handful of people standing at the right angle, contained more than most speeches manage in 10 minutes. They contained the weight of everything she had been through. They contained gratitude for being here, for having him, for being well enough to stand in a cold English afternoon and do work that mattered. They contained grief for the year that had been taken, for the version of herself she had been before the diagnosis, for the ordinary plans that had been set aside. And they contained something fierce and forward-looking that had no easy name but lived in the particular set of jaw and the deliberate placement of a foot taking the next step. She stepped forward. She joined her husband. She smiled at someone who was waiting to speak to her and gave that person her full attention. The afternoon continued. By the time the day's engagements were drawing toward their close, something had settled over the crowd that gathered for the final appearance. The gray of the morning had not fully lifted. The sky was still the specific shade of pewter that the English sky achieves when it cannot decide between rain and simple reluctance. But it felt different, less heavy. Or perhaps the people standing under it were carrying something less heavy than they had been carrying when they arrived. A woman standing near the barrier, who had come with her teenage daughter, was overheard saying something that a journalist nearby quietly noted. She was not speaking for publication. She was just speaking the way people speak when they're feeling something and need to put it into words. She said, "I don't usually care about this kind of thing. But today was different. Today felt like something." Her daughter, phone in hand, half listening in the way teenagers do, looked up at the departing figures of the prince and princess and said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "She looks like herself again." It was perhaps the most precise thing anyone said all day. She looked like herself. After everything, the diagnosis, the surgery, the chemotherapy, the months of silence and rest and rebuilding, she had come back looking like herself. Not untouched, not unchanged, but recognizably, fundamentally herself. And William, beside her, looked like the man who had stayed, who had always stayed, who would keep staying. The step they had taken together that day was a small physical act. But in the life of a nation that had been watching and waiting and hoping, it was something much larger. It was proof, quiet, human, imperfect, genuine proof that some things hold. The car carrying them disappeared around a corner. The crowd stayed a little longer than crowds usually do. No one was quite ready to leave yet, because sometimes a moment is too full to simply walk away from, and you need to stand inside it a little while just to feel the whole of it. Tomorrow would bring new difficulties. There would be more recovery ahead, for Catherine, for William, for a country that was tired in its own ways. Nothing had been solved by one afternoon in a gray English town. The world does not work like that. But something had been given. Something real and lasting had passed between two people and a nation in the specific language of a step taken forward, together, honestly, without pretending anything was easier than it was. And that, as it turned out, was enough. For today, it was exactly enough. Some stories end with fireworks. Others end with a door quietly closing at the end of a long day. Two people sitting down together in the silence they have built and earned and fought for, the ordinary, extraordinary silence of a life shared. This is one of those stories. It does not end with triumph or announcement. It ends with something harder to describe and more lasting to carry. The particular piece of people who have looked at each other across the bottom of a very deep place and found that they were still, somehow, together, still standing, still choosing, still here. The drive home that evening was quiet. That is not a detail anyone reported publicly, but it is the kind of detail that is almost always true after a day like that one. A day that takes everything a person has and gives it to other people, leaving behind a specific and honorable exhaustion. Catherine sat with her head resting lightly against the window. Not asleep, just still. Outside, the English countryside moved past in the last gray light of an autumn afternoon. Hedgerows and fields and the occasional lit window of a farmhouse appearing and disappearing like thoughts too brief to catch. William drove. He had preferred to drive himself when circumstances allowed for as long as anyone could remember. It was one of the small privacies he had protected throughout a life almost entirely without privacy. Driving meant his hands were occupied with something practical. It meant the silence had a purpose. It meant the two of them could be in the same space without performing anything for anyone, not even for each other. He glanced at her once, in the way a person glances at someone they love when they think that person isn't looking. She was looking at the window. He looked back at the road. Nothing was said, but in the nothing, everything was present. The day that had just been, the months that had preceded it, the years before that, the children at home waiting, the life still in progress, still being built and tended and loved. The days that followed moved differently than the days before had. Something had loosened, not in a dramatic way, not in a way that announced itself, but in the slow and genuine way of things returning to their natural state after a long period of being held rigid by necessity. Catherine began appearing more regularly, still carefully, still with intention rather than compulsion. Each appearance was chosen rather than obligatory. She was not returning to a pre-illness schedule of relentless public duty. She was returning to something more considered, more honest, more aligned with the person she had become through the experience of facing her own mortality and surviving it. That distinction between returning to what was and moving toward what is now turned out to be one of the most important and quietly revolutionary things about her reemergence. She was not pretending the year hadn't happened. She was not rushing back to normal as though normal were still available in its previous form. She was building a new normal, one that incorporated what she had learned about herself, about her limits, her priorities, her deepest values during the long months of illness. In interviews and statements that came in the weeks following, she spoke about this with a directness that struck many people as different from the carefully managed public voice of before. She spoke about fear. She spoke about what it means to sit with uncertainty and find that you are not destroyed by it. She spoke about her children in the specific, grounded way of a parent who has confronted the possibility of not being there and has come back with a fiercer appreciation of exactly what being there means. She spoke about William with a quietness and gratitude that was more revealing than any formal declaration could have been, simply, directly, as someone who knows what they have because they have come close enough to losing it to understand its full weight. William, in those weeks, began his own kind of resurfacing. The long months of holding everything together while remaining in the background, present but not prominent, supporting but not centered, had taken something from him that was only now beginning to return. He was, by the account of those who knew him, lighter. Not because the difficulties were over, they were not, fully, but because the particular concentrated dread of watching someone you love in serious danger had lifted enough to allow other things back in. He was photographed laughing more. Not the careful, managed public laugh, but the real one, the one that gets into the eyes and into the shoulders, the whole body laugh of someone who has remembered that life contains joy as well as fear, and that both are allowed to exist simultaneously. He was seen with the children in contexts that felt genuinely unguarded. On school runs, at weekend activities, in the kind of ordinary parental scenes that royal protocols usually smooth and sanitize, but that now, perhaps because the ordinary had become so precious, seemed to resist that smoothing. A teacher at one of the children's schools, speaking to a friend rather than to any press, mentioned that the children seemed more settled. That's the word she used, settled. It is a small word carrying enormous content, because unsettled children are the honest barometers of unsettled homes, and Settled children are the quiet testament to adults who have done the hard work of keeping their own ground firm even when the ground was moving. George, Charlotte, and Louis had been through something that most children never face: the fear of losing a parent. And the adults in their lives had done everything within their power to carry that weight so that the children could carry something lighter. Back in the country beyond the palace walls, the days after the step continued to settle into people in ways that surprised even those who were surprised by the depth of their own reaction on the day itself. A man in Sheffield who had watched the footage on his phone during his lunch break at work found himself thinking about it days later. Not about the royals specifically, but about his own marriage. His wife had been through a difficult period the previous year. Not illness, but a different kind of darkness, the kind that settles over people sometimes without warning and makes everything heavy and gray. He had stayed. There had been days when staying was very hard. And watching a prince and a princess choose to step forward together after something enormous had happened to them reminded him, in a way he couldn't fully explain rationally, that he had made the right choice. That staying is worth it. That the other side of a hard thing, if you go through it together, is somewhere worth being. A teenage girl in Edinburgh who had been following Catherine's illness with a frightened identification. Her own mother had been diagnosed with breast cancer the same year. Watched the footage in her bedroom with her door closed and cried for a long time. Not sad tears, or not only sad tears. The release of something that had been held under enormous pressure for months. Her mother was doing better. Catherine was doing better. In the private geography of her heart, the two things had become connected, and Catherine stepped forward felt irrationally and completely like a good omen for the thing she cared about most in the world. An elderly man in a care home in Wales, whose wife of 54 years had died the previous spring, watched the news coverage in the common room with the careful, still attention of someone carrying loss. When it ended, he said to the care worker beside him that it was good to see. She asked him what specifically was good. He thought for a moment. Then, he said, the way they walk together. Like they know each other. That's what 50 years looks like if you do it right. He paused. I hope they get their 50 years. The broader conversation that the day sparked was not, in the end, primarily about royalty. That was what surprised the commentators and journalists who had expected to write about the politics of the institution, about succession and duty and the machinery of monarchy. Those pieces were written, of course, but they were not what resonated. What resonated in letters to newspapers, in comment sections, in conversations between strangers on public transport, in the specific and reliable mechanism of social media, which amplifies whatever emotion is already running strongest, was something much more personal. People recognized themselves, not their circumstances, not their privilege or their problems, but something underneath all of that, the experience of love being tested and surviving the test. The experience of watching someone you love suffer and not being able to fix it and staying anyway. The experience of coming out the other side of something terrible and having to decide every single day to keep choosing forward. These are human experiences, not royal ones. And when they were visible in the faces of two people happening to live a royal life, the humanity in them traveled straight through the screen and into the chests of ordinary people everywhere. That is ultimately the thing that made the day matter beyond the day itself. It was not spectacle. It was not ceremony. It was not the continuation of a fairy tale that began with a cathedral wedding and a billion viewers. It was something plainer and truer. Two people diminished and rebuilt and still present, choosing to walk toward what came next. Months later, looking back at the photographs from that day, there is one that keeps returning to people's attention. Not the formally composed shot, not the wide crowd scene, not the image that ran on front pages. It is a smaller image, taken at an angle, in a moment between moments. Catherine is mid-step. William is turning slightly toward her. Their hands are not quite touching. Close, almost, but not quite. Both of them are looking forward. And in both their faces, visible even in a photograph, in the two-dimensional flat record of a single second, there is something that the people who keep returning to that image consistently describe in the same way. They look like they know where they're going. Not with certainty, Life does not offer certainty, and both of them have learned that with a completeness that most people are spared, but with intention, with the particular direction of people who have had everything stripped away down to the essential and have found that what remained was enough. More than enough. Enough to build from. Enough to walk toward. The step that spoke volumes was not one step in the end. It was every step. All the steps taken together during the months of illness, the invisible steps across hospital corridors and through long nights and over the difficult mornings when getting up felt like an actual rather than instinct. It was all the steps William took alone when Catherine needed rest, and the steps she took when no one was watching, rebuilding her body and her confidence in private, away from cameras and coverage and the relentless pressure of being looked at. All of those invisible steps led to the visible one, the one a nation watched, the one that said, simply and completely, we are still here. We are still going. Whatever comes next, we will meet it the same way we met everything that came before, together, imperfectly, honestly, and without stopping. Britain exhaled. A country that had been holding its breath for a long time finally, gradually let it go. And somewhere in a quiet house away from the noise of headlines and history, 3 children who did not yet understand the full shape of what their parents had been through wrapped themselves around their mother and were wrapped in return, and the world continued its turning, and the step forward was taken again, as it always must be in the smallest and most sacred privacy of an ordinary evening, going home.